So, John, it's awesome to hang out on today and go through this discussion. We're talking today about emotional readiness for closing, and for all of the presidents and the owners out there that are looking at selling their business at some point, like this is going to be a really great topic. It's especially the idea of preparing mentally for selling. And so, welcome. Maybe give a quick background. You work with Calhoun. Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Appreciate you having me on the podcast, and thanks for all you do for the manufacturing industry. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are aware of the impact you've made over the years and all of what you've done. But from me to you, thanks. I appreciate what you're doing. It's fun to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah. So John Tichich, with Calhoun Companies, we've been around for 116 years. I've been with the company for a little over 2 years now. I've been in the M&A space for over 11 years now, and I would say the back half of my career so far has been focused on helping manufacturing companies sell. Uh,
That's why I've talked to a lot of people in the space, and one of the reasons I think we resonated is because of the manufacturing focus. So I love that. And it's interesting now with the timing of this, just because the elections are over, there's a bunch of things going on in the space at the moment. And so, maybe people are thinking differently, right? It's coming up to the holidays, New Year's resolutions, the elections are done, like, okay, where are we at? And so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
yeah, yeah, it's timely. So yeah, I've been focused on, just to kind of close the loop on what I do. I've been focused on sell side representation for manufacturing business owners that are, that don't have a family member to turn to, although I do get involved with some of those from time to time. But primarily that don't have an option available to them. And so they come to me to help value the company, prepare them for market, go to market, you know,
Get ready.
create a marketplace for their company, right? And find the buyer that's going to take it over when they leave. So that, in a nutshell, is what I've been doing for the last 11 years. And like I said, for the last 5 or 6, heavily focused on manufacturing. So,
That's cool. And so when we get into this discussion, the first area that we wanted to talk about is why you think emotional readiness is crucial in the sales process. So getting ready emotionally to sell. And so my first question is, when you talk about selling a business, especially in manufacturing,
yeah.
why do you think emotional readiness is often overlooked, but still really essential?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. And, preparing emotionally can be a challenge. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it doesn't really become real until you have an LOI in your hand and you got to sign it. Um, but, a lot of people, when they think about a business transaction, they just think of the dollars and cents and the financial component of it. But in reality, the emotional component of selling is just as critical to prepare for, as the financial side of it. So it's, really is the foundation of a smooth and successful sale. Um, but it is overlooked because people, there's no, there are resources out there, right? But when you think about selling your company, it's almost like taboo in some sense, especially for founders, right? That's
Especially
those are
for
the
founders.
Especially for founders. They grapple with it the most, right? So if you have um owners that didn't found the company, they didn't start it from ground zero and build it up to where dozens of employees are relying on them to, put food on the table. Those folks have a much easier time preparing for sale because they're not attached to it like a founder is.
Well, you talk about that, and I actually can appreciate this having been a founder as a founder, right? So one of these challenges that you go through is, so often our work is our identity.
Yeah.
And so your business is your baby. It becomes your identity, especially for founders. So when you're talking through this emotional readiness, what are some of the hurdles that the executive, the owner has to work through? What are the common hurdles that you see they face?
Yeah, well, the unknown of who's gonna buy it, right? So when we talk about, you know, why is it important to prepare emotionally? Um, you know, back to kind of what I was saying, it's almost taboo. You don't know who to talk to. You really want to keep it confidential. And so maybe you talk to your CPA or your attorney or maybe a buddy who sold their company, right? But and those are all good resources, right? But it's I think even um expanding that network a little bit to maybe somebody like me, somebody who's really in the trenches on a day-to-day basis, selling companies, navigating this process for manufacturing business owners is, provides a different perspective on what you can expect throughout the whole process. So, a lot of the challenges that they face emotionally is fear, right? They're afraid to let go. They don't know who the buyer's going to be, so there's some uncertainty. Those things kind of tie together. I think the fear might be driven by the uncertainty in some ways.
Is it really from your perspective? Is it more fear around they're afraid that someone's going to come in and chop it up for parts? Is it that they're afraid that their employees aren't going to be taken care of? Are they afraid that they're not going to they're going to get taken advantage of? Like, what do you think the baseline of those fears typically are?
Yeah, I don't hear too often that, it's gonna get just sliced up and chopped for parts, but the fear of what's gonna happen to their employees is always top of the list when they're because I mean, they business owners care about their employees, right? They really do. And as you know, there's nothing fancy about a CNC machine. I mean, they're cool, right? And they're great, and they have some really crazy capabilities, but you gotta have somebody to do the setup, right? And you gotta have somebody to switch out the tools and run the parts and so on and so forth. So the people are, in my opinion, I think universally agreed that the people are more important than the machines. You and I could go buy a CNC machine, right? But you gotta have somebody to operate them. And, something that I've been working on with the MPMA is workforce development. I mean, there's just not a lot of people available to run these machines. So, so the fear of what's going to happen to their people is huge, right? They're always concerned about that. And ironically, that's one of the major concerns that buyers have.
Talk about
Once again,
that a little bit. Talk about
so I always get a kick out of it inside because I know that those concerns are aligned, right? So just like I said, the workforce, you know, it isn't growing for manufacturing companies, right? I mean, it says to get
topic, by the way.
right, but to get talented machinists or tool makers or programmers, they're hard to find. Everyone's looking for 'em. And so that's one of the key considerations when somebody's buying a manufacturing company is what does the workforce look like? Right. And so oftentimes what I'll do is in my, presentations, which I might be getting ahead a little bit here, but when I'm presenting a business for sale, one of the slides is the employees. And, not only is it pay rate or tenure, but it's age,
Mm.
right? You got to have the age in there because that's important to the buyers because they know programmers aren't growing on trees. And so if a big chunk of your workforce is, nearing retirement, that can be problematic. And they really dig into that. Okay, yeah, and on the flip side, if you have, a good training program in house and you're, pulling people off the street and you're finding ways to get them to set up machines, that adds value. So the fear, right, of what's going to happen to the employees is shared amongst buyers and sellers, right?
So it's interesting. It's interesting as you bring that up because one of the other questions is how did that actually impact the deal? So to your point,
Yeah.
taking a proactive look at how do we actually get prepared emotionally and actually how does that impact the deal when you actually step back and think about the team and you think about what you're building as a team and what that team makeup looks like and are they ready for a new owner maybe emotionally, that actually impacts your valuation. So it has much broader ramifications, even in the amount you can get for or the multiple or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Well, and so sellers obviously are concerned that the whoever buys the company is going to make personnel changes, right? And when I'm initially talking to a seller, we don't know who the buyer is yet. right? So the buyer's kind of the boogeyman. We don't know them, we don't know what they're going to do. But if I or anyone else representing the company does a good job, we're going to have several options that they can choose from. And we'll have had several conversations with what their intentions are post close. And, universally across the board, none of them say we're going to get rid of your management team, or we're going to, eliminate, your production workers, or, your assemblers, or whatever they are. Uh, it's in fact the opposite. I mean, they all want to find ways to grow the company, to give those folks more opportunities to advance in the company. They want to keep them, so oftentimes you might see like stay bonuses or something like that, which, um, can be a component of the deal. But to your first question, like what are some of the hurdles that the emotional side, creates. The fear of what's going to happen to the employees is almost comical, because the buyer and the seller are so aligned on that. The
So
seller doesn't
that's actually that's a really helpful. I mean, from people watching this that are likely in that going into that sell mode, you wouldn't think that necessarily intuitively walking into these situations that that sync up is actually there. Because most people, I think that they think they're going to sell their business and the hatchet man's going to come in and clean house, but
right.
you're actually saying that's not the case at all.
Yeah, no, it's not. No, it's not. But it's off. I mean, both sides, bring it up, right? They all want to know what's going to happen to the employees, and the answer is the same thing. Nothing negative in most cases, right? I mean, every now and then, Jeff, you might get, like, with smaller companies, you might have an absentee owned business where, the owner is, hasn't sold it. They're in their 70s, and they've kind of delegated all their stuff to a general manager or something like that. Maybe it's small enough for an individual to acquire, and then they might take care of the GM's position. But even then, it's like even those folks understand the benefits of having somebody at the helm that has the relationships with the employees and the customers to steer the ship. I've actually never seen someone's head roll post closing, at least short term. Um,
Well, it's a risk problem, right? I mean, if you think about it from a buyer, now we're talking percent seller where they're at, but a buyer that doesn't make sense either because the last thing the buyer wants to do is buy something and implode it.
right.
So they're definitely looking for some level of stability so that they don't screw up the deal, which is the whole reason they bought the company. And so, putting it in that perspective maybe would set a seller at ease.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And that the scenario I laid out there is pretty exotic. I mean, it rarely happens. And oftentimes you might even see the flip side of that, where, you have a key management team, and the buyer wants to really make sure that they stay in place, and they will offer incentives for them to stay in place. Uh, because they know, I mean, the programmers, the setup guys, the machinists, the executive team, they all know that they could, throw a rock and find another shop that they can go to,
Right.
right? I mean, they're in high demand, and they know that. And buyers know that too. And so sometimes they'll even offer incentives for them to stick around, to make sure they don't go anywhere. So I always get a kick out of that fear, of the, uncertainty with what's going to happen to the employees, because the buyers and sellers are so aligned with that. But every client talks about it. What happens when you sell? What happens to the people? Well, um,
You still got a business.
I can tell them to listen to our podcast now. So yeah.
So are there other hurdles that we haven't talked about yet? Are we pretty good? Are there other emotional hurdles that you see?
Well, yeah, I mean, it gets back, it stems to your first question. How do you prepare emotionally? A lot of these people don't prepare emotionally, right? And they might just talk to their CPA about evaluation. And then when the numbers kind of get to where it makes sense for them, and most of these folks are retiring. And so when it gets to, when their financial advisor says, yeah, that's enough to get you, through retirement, then that in my opinion, is one component. The other component is, are they ready personally?
So
And
talk
so,
about that. What does that mean?
So the personal component is, when they have the next phase figured out, like what I hesitate to take on any client, any business owner that doesn't have an answer to that question, which is, what are you going to do when you sell the company? Right. If you don't have the answer to that, it's going to be a tall task into the finish line because you've got to have something to do. And most of my clients are founders. And if they don't have that motivation to move on from the company, they probably won't. Right. And so I'll ask them 3, 4, 5 different ways to get to that answer and make sure that they have really thought it through. And if they don't have that answer, it's a really difficult task getting them because the idea of selling might sound great, right? But once and I've had this happen, Jeff. It's y- and oddly enough, getting back to the election, I don't want to get political here, but um, whatever. When Biden got elected, I got 4 phone calls because cap gains tax was on the ballot. And there was a chance that the capital gains was going to double, right? So those folks that were maybe 3, 4, 5 years out of selling called me after the election. They said, "Hey, I don't want to roll the dice here. Let's do this now." And so there again, the financial component kind of kicked in, but they weren't ready personally. And I had this happen with a client where we had 5 or 6 different offers on it, all very good buyers, very capable buyers. And I remember where I was when we were talking about this. We were analyzing each offer, going through them, kind of comparing all of them. And they looked at me. We had to pick one. It was our job to figure out which one we were going to pick, right? And we got through. They humored me for a good 45, 50 minutes of going, hearing my thoughts on, hey, here are the pros and cons of each of these offers and each of these buyers. But as soon as I shut my mouth, they said, "I don't think we're ready for this, John." So it's fine. I wish you would have told me, 4 months ago, but, so anyway, they ended up taking a step back and coming back to the table, and we found a solution for them. But if they don't have the answer to that question, what they're gonna do next, it's a big red flag. And so preparing emotionally, as difficult as it can be, it's really important because it doesn't really become real until you have offers in place and you have to sign one, and that's you committing to a transaction. So if you're not prepared, it can cause problems, no doubt about it.
So are there, I mean, so you talk about those. Are there other hurdles that you see typically coming up, or is that the bulk of it?
Well, so that's the bulk of it. But also there's especially in manufacturing, there's nuances to these transactions, right? And if you're not talking to somebody who's navigated those nuances time and time again, doesn't know what likely outcomes are going to be, right? When we talk about working capital, when we talk about work in process, right? You might, how these are all major considerations in the equation of selling a manufacturing company. If you don't know where that middle ground is on some of these key topics that oftentimes aren't hammered out at the time of the LOI. They're usually hammered out in due diligence. If you don't have somebody to set those expectations, um, they can be painful conversations to have, and those nuances along the way, if you're not prepared for them, you can feel like as a business owner, like you're getting screwed,
Yeah.
right?
I've
Even
actually
though
I've actually seen that happen in some of the cases of ones I've been involved in. It's like they don't talk about inventory until the very end, or they don't talk about scrap costs, or they don't talk about materials they can't use or fill or obsolete products or whatever. And then at the end, it's like they take the number and then they start, yep, we're gonna cross that out. And we're gonna go deduct boom, 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 right down the list, right? And say,
yeah,
oh, all of a sudden I thought I was getting X and now I'm getting Y, but I'm already emotionally committed to being done and I'm down the LOI route. So it's like do I tell them no, go pound sand and start over? Like that's,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. So, I mean, part of what I found to be very helpful for this particularly manufacturing business owners is to really paint that picture for them up front before they sign up, right? So it's, here's the value of your company. That's one component. But then you got to address all the other components. Here's a normal level of working capital. Here's how we calculate working capital. Here's what's going to happen to the work in process. The finished goods, oftentimes you'll see these machine shops stock up on finished goods because they know their customers are going to reorder those parts over time. At least they think they know that, right? I mean, having finished goods on hand is a risk. If you get, if you change one of those, a rev to one of those parts, everything on the shelf becomes obsolete, right? But they get numb to that risk and they, don't understand how buyers are going to look at that and how they're going to value it. So I'll paint that picture and make some reasonable assumptions. Like I said, value is one thing. It's probably this part of the equation. And then you got, the other 2/3, 3/4 of the spreadsheet that paints the picture of all these other components that come into play through the due diligence process, right? And it's a nice reference to have when those topics come up, and I can say, look, we've talked about this. Yes, it's been 3-4 months since we talked about it, but if you remember, this is what I think is market. And sure enough, we just got to find a way to get there with the buyer. So
so, you talked about this. I'm going to kind of move on to the emotional journey piece, right? So
yeah.
when you're talking to a manufacturer, when you're talking to the owner, and what kind of advice do you give them out of the gate to kind of prep them emotionally, right? When they're maybe not in the right headspace, you meet with them the first time, like, is there things that they can tactically do to help themselves? Is there things that you try to like educate them on to make sure that they get there if they're not there, whatever it might be?
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that I do is really walk them through the entire process of what a transaction looks like, right? And that might start with, who do you want to sell to, right? Do you want to sell to a private equity group? I mean, there's plenty of really good private equity groups, credible private equity groups that have, long histories of success. But all it takes is one of their buddies to sell their company to a private equity group and, things went sideways after the close or whatever. That does happen. And then all of a sudden they associate private equity with, negative outcomes. And so it might start as, who do you want to sell to, right? Do you want a strategic? Do you want a private equity group? Do you want a family office? Does an individual make sense? Somebody who's been in the industry for a while, has some cash laying around and can afford to pull this off, right? So that's one place to start to kind of identify who we should be going after, right? And then from there, it's, it kind of back to your the first topic here. It can be really difficult to prepare. You got to ask all sorts of questions that indicate whether they're ready or not. Uh, but yeah, I mean, the emotional component can certainly be a journey, but I think understanding what's important to them, right? And something that I find a lot of these folks will answer with is, it's not just about the numbers, right? It's not, hey, go give me the highest bidder and that's the one we're taking, right? It's, I want the best buyer for the company, right? Somebody who, belongs. Cause I mean, all these manufacturing companies have different cultures, right? And you got to have somebody that's going to fit into that culture and not, you know, try to, implement a new culture that maybe doesn't mesh well with the one that they've established. So,
It's one of the things that I see as because I'm doing this with a number of clients. We're working through that kind of that cell, and that actually meeting with families, multiple siblings, multiple generation, trying to work them through that kind of emotional state. One of the
yeah,
questions that I think does come up is the legacy question, right?
yeah,
So as an owner, I might have had a dream, a vision of what I wanted it to become, and maybe I'm there, maybe I'm not there, maybe, maybe I was there a long, long time ago and it's way bigger than I ever expected to be. And so one of the things that I run into is like, what was the vision? What was the desire up front? And have we achieved that or not? Or is there some place where, yes, when I check these boxes, then I will have done what I was hoping to do and can leave a legacy and it will say what it is. And I think that's different for everybody. I think one of the other things that I run into a fair bit too is, you talk about the emotional readiness of what am I going to do next? And a big thing that, I've seen a lot or we run into a lot is people can't let go of their businesses even when they should.
Yep.
Right, and we've seen this late career, late 70s, 80s, whatever it is, and they're still, like, trying to control and own it because it's who they are, but also understanding, I think, emotionally that sometimes our businesses outgrow us,
Oh yeah.
and there's a reality, there's a humbleness that needs to happen that says, I'm actually not the right person for the team and for the business because one of the things I've seen, I don't know if you've seen this, but it seems like leaders, owners, they have certain plateaus. There's the
Yeah.
person that gets it from 0 to 5 million. There's the person that gets it from 5 to 20, and there's a 25 and 25 to 100. Like, but then they tap out,
Yeah.
and then the business just peaks and just kind of sits there because it's not that the business couldn't grow, it's that the individual that's in it is not the right person to take it up a level, so the team is actually hamstrung by that growth. So, I mean, emotionally, when you think about that, is that what are the things that you're seeing? How does that play into the consideration as a leader, as an owner?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's couple things to touch on there, and I'm sure you see this more than I do, right? Because you're, I mean, first of all, you've been at this longer than I have, but um, y- the comment you made about having a vision and executing that vision as the business grows is really difficult. Back to founders, particularly for founders, because a lot of these guys started from nothing.
Shiny objects.
Yeah, started from nothing. All of a sudden, in one example, I've seen a 300,000 square foot facility, 60 million in revenue, and it's still the guy that started in his garage, right? And he knows how to do everything better than everybody else. And they have the biggest issue delegating those responsibilities and really stepping back and looking at the business from a high level. And the guy still has his, I mean, he's got over 100 employees and his cell phone's on the website and he's servicing customers. Like,
By the way, if I haven't said it recently, every president should go get an EA, if nothing else, an executive assistant fractionally. I don't care if it's 20 hours a week, just to learn how to let go of control. That's a
yeah,
start.
yeah, easier said than done, though.
Easy.
Said than done. Yeah. But, so, and I think it's interesting because I think that's what a lot of the buyers bring to the table is executing a bigger vision, right? And putting the right people in the right positions to execute on that vision, right? And I do think that reassuring business owners that are selling that, look, because I mean, everybody sells for different reasons, right? And there might even be a place for the business owner that's selling in the company post close, maybe long term, right? Sometimes they've gotten it to that $5 or $10 million level and it's just become this animal that they can't control anymore. And they get burnt out because they're working 60, 70 hours a week and they're trying to do everything themselves. They still really like what they do. They're making great money at it. But they just can't be three places at once anymore. Right. And then next thing you know, their kids are graduating high school. Right.
And they haven't had any time with them.
Yeah. And it's,
They're exhausted.
they're exhausted. So I think, and when you sell companies on a regular basis, you hear of the success stories and what the different benefits are of letting go and letting somebody else take it on. I say somebody else, it could be, a number of different types of buyers, but I think in large part, especially when you get north of 5 million of enterprise value, in large part, the buyer that's going to take that on is really good at delegating, putting people in the right place, and allowing the company to continue to flourish, right? And a lot of times they'll want the current owner to stay in place for an extended period of time if they're not 65, 70 years old and have a place in Florida picked out.
Yeah,
Like,
or disruptive. So I
well,
think
you're
that's
right.
that's
Yeah.
one, one of the keys on this is the average life expectancy of the president slash owner that sells is low, not because the business doesn't want them in, but because they aren't mentally prepared to sell, so they get frustrated and upset with the person that takes it over because they don't call the shots anymore.
Yep.
And so part of going back to this mental preparation is also one of the things I think about is, you talk about how do I think about my future? What was my activities going to be once I sell?
Yep.
Part of that might be that, hey, if I was a president before, but I'm really good at sales and I enjoy the sales aspect, can I mentally shift into sales and crush sales knowing that I'm not the president anymore? So there are options in the selling process to say, I don't necessarily have to do the same role. And I'm okay with that because I just love hanging out with the customers.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's funny because, uh, again, the fear of the unknown, right? What's going to happen to the employees? What's going to happen to me? Right. That's another one, especially if they, I get clients all the time that are in their late 40s, early 50s, and they're not ready to, go golfing every day or, go kick their feet up on the beach. Um, so that they want to be engaged, but they're dealing with so many different things. They have, they just want to get rid of the headaches, right? And get back to when the company was simpler, smaller, and simpler, and do what they enjoy doing that got them to where they are
In the
now.
first place. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's like, okay, well, great. You know, one of the who do we want to sell to, and what do we want to do post close, right?
Yeah,
Well,
that's actually that's a really big topic because I know as an owner founder, one of the things that I have to do regularly is kind of going back to standard work. You talk about manufacturing, you talk about standard work. There's a number of tools, there's the, you know, effort and impact. There's, what gives me charges my batteries, what drains my batteries versus, where do I add value, where I don't add value, whatever the exercise techniques. I think it's important that the owners from my perspective, what I've seen is it's really important as an owner to sit down and understand if I would look at my activities over the
yeah,
course of a week, what do I really want those activities to be after? And I'm guessing in many cases, if they are working 60, 70 hours a week, the stats from my perspective are typically that if I have 30 activities that I do typically in a week, probably somewhere between 50 and 60% of those activities I should not be doing, especially as a president owner, and it's usually between 30 and 50% of my hours.
yeah,
And so sometimes if just taking a simple exercise like that can just free up the emotional piece because you realize, "Oh, I don't really like being a president," or you know what? I don't really like being a visionary, or I don't want the responsibilities because what I really like doing is this activity. So if I can do that 40 hours a week instead of 10,
yeah,
I'm good to go.
yeah. You're spot on. And I think what a lot of folks fail to realize is that they do have a lot of control over that, right? So, just sold a company last year. Is a great example, right? I mean, he actually acquired it from his dad back in the early 2000s, the metal fab shop, and for like $8,000. His dad, didn't do well with it. He bought one piece of machine that was worth $8,000, and he took over the company. And then next thing you know, he's got only 10,000 square feet, but he was doing 12 million in revenue and very profitable. But he had a family and he was missing out on some things that he was getting tired of missing out on. And he's getting pulled in all these different directions. And when he and I start chatting, it's like, okay, do you really want to let go? Is this, really what you want to do? And the answer was no. But there were certain things that he wanted to let go of that he didn't want to do anymore. And it's, oh, okay, great. Let's put that in the presentation so buyers are aware of it. Right. and they'll factor that into their investment considerations, but they're still going to be interested. It's not going to deter them from your company. And so
Yeah.
and so they what they fail to recognize is that they do have a lot of control over that, right? There might be buyers that say, you know what, we want the whole thing. We don't want you to be involved. Great. I'll flush that out before I even, get them to sign an NDA and tell them who the business is, right? So I'll be very upfront. Hey, these are some key components that are important to my client. If any of them are non-starters, I'll wait. I'll find another one for you. So it's, it's I don't know, it's not strange, but I think it's important for a lot of business owners to recognize that they do have more control of this process than they think.
Well, they probably think it's a binary. I'm in, I'm out, and it doesn't
Right.
have to be. There is so much gray in the middle that I don't have to be 0% owner. I could be 10%, 20%, 30%. I could have certain types of roles. Like you're saying, is part of that is really thinking about there's tremendous amount of options.
Yeah.
And I think if they really understand what does a good week look like to them in the future, then that I think that answering that question really helps them through that journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in this example, we ended up finding someone who was willing to, it was a private equity group that allowed him to keep 15% of the company and really spelled out what he was going to do, really defined his role to fit what he wanted. They put a timeline. A lot of them will put a timeline on when you have to sell that retained equity because their plan is to grow it exponentially. But they also have some say in that, right? So a lot of times it might be a 3-year put option or a 5-year put option. Sometimes you can leave it open ended and just have it mutually agreed upon. But they may not want to stay for more than 3 years or 5 years. They may want to just say, this is when I'm going to sell the equity that I keep. And, and it's, so, but he had no idea. He was like, oh, you can do that. Well, yeah.
You're not unlimited.
Right.
So one of the last series that I want to talk about is the emotional resilience, right? So because we talk about emotional readiness and we're talking about a lot of these options that are just giving people, and sometimes the options are overwhelming, right? Because it's like, I'm not sure what all the options are. And that's where talking to someone like you is helpful because you can map out it's a fixed list, have a fixed number of options. Here are the 8 that make sense. Here are the 25 that don't. Like there's not 26, that kind of thing. But the going back to the emotional resilience, have there been, let's say, examples? Have there been like a good test case example for you of an owner who kind of prepared themselves, built that resilience, built that emotional kind of readiness? Do you have an example you can kind of talk through of what they did to kind of get ready to become resilient, to get through that emotional piece as they entered into a sale?
Yeah. Well, so
And when I'm saying that, I mean for themselves personally
yeah.
to be ready.
Yeah. Well, there's one in particular right now that there's a lot of business owners that I talked to for several years, right? Because they understand that it's more than just the financial component that plays into this decision. So they'll talk to me and say, hey, what are your thoughts on, expanding the business this direction or that direction, right? Is it going to add value? In my opinion, I'll get to your kind of to your question here, but the way that I see it, Jeff, there's really two major components to a business valuation. Okay. You have the EBITDA and the multiple. Okay. That's really simple, right? But the multiple is there's a spectrum. There's a huge range of multiples, especially within manufacturing. I mean, you can sell them for a 2 multiple of EBITDA. You can go north of 10. And so what one client in particular has been talking to me about is how do I grow the multiple, right? And the uneducated answer is, well, increase your EBITDA, right? You get to 1 million of EBITDA, it's going to go up a little bit. You get to 2 million, it might go up a little bit. You get to 5 million EBITDA, the multiples are going to grow with it. But the other side of it is, in my opinion, the multiple, accounts for the risk.
Hmm.
Okay. So the less risk, the higher the multiple.
Interesting.
Okay. So I'll give you an example. So if you're like a prototype job shop, right? And you're, you know, doing one setup for a handful of parts, right? And then just rinsing and repeating that model over and over again. You don't know what part you're making next, who it's coming from, right? There's risk to that, right? Compared to a production type shop, right? That has high certifications like a 13485. Maybe they're doing implantables that go into the human body, right? Not every shop has that certification or can do that, right? And they might have blanket purchase orders from customers with release dates throughout the year. Which one would you rather have, right? I think the answer is obvious. So, so you know, so enhancing the de-risking the transaction increases the value, right? You might have flatline EBITDA, but if you're working on de-risking your company, whether you're diversifying your end markets, your customer base, you're, putting key people in positions that, that you're delegating your day-to-day responsibilities, you're making yourself very replaceable. If you have flat EBITDA, your business is still growing. The value of it is still growing because you're de-risking the transaction. And so I mean, there's a lot of folks that don't do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's not something that I normally, you think about leveraging a business, right? You think about, is my EBITDA growing faster than my revenue, and am I leveraging, deleveraging? That usually, that's the kind of stuff you start to think about to drive, the multiples. But thinking about it from a pure risk management standpoint, I guess that's a great one for people to think about.
Yeah. So, right, like building your emotional resilience, right, is just as critical as getting financially prepared,
Hmm.
right? And so how do you do that? You got to talk to, not just me, but anybody who can prepare you for that, right? So it's in the very first time I talk to somebody in this space, it's just an educational dump, right? Because they have this idea of, what a transaction looks like, how to value a company, so on and so forth. And then I explain to them in depth what I just kind of touched on with you, with growing the multiple and how to do that. They go, huh? They sit back and you can like see them thinking, okay, how can I do that? Right. And if they're not, if they're proactive in getting in front of somebody that can give them that information versus coming to me ready to sign up, versus being reactive, maybe something happened, they're burnt out or illness or divorce or whatever. If they're proactive and actually have some time to prepare, I mean, those folks, the chances of success are exponentially higher with the people that actually get in front of somebody and talk through all of this, right?
So that's interesting that you bring up that point. So there's this whole advisory board kind of mindset, right? Whether it's the financial advisory, mentors, therapists, whatever you got to do to get to that place.
Yeah.
But what really is striking to that conversation is there is there's no bad day to start the process,
Right.
because really it doesn't matter if you're going to sell in a year, 5 years, 10 years. You should be thinking as an owner all the time in that vein
Yep.
and prepping for it all the time, which it ties back to the resilience because you're always thinking in that vein.
Yeah. Well, and I think you can relate to this, Jeff. I mean, you and I, we help people, right? We love doing it. And so every now and then I'll get somebody who calls me up and says, "Hey, I saw your ad in the magazine, or I heard about you from somebody." Um, you know, I'm not ready to sell, and I don't think I will be within the next 5 years, but I'd love to pick your brain and get your thoughts on, what the value is and, maybe what are some of the things that I should be thinking about as I'm setting up for sale. Because I mean, a lot of these things take time. You can't just, send them home on a Friday and they come back on Monday and it's all put in place, right? I mean, some of these take years to
I mean, you're going to build
implement.
leadership teams. If you're going to
Right.
build out, all the systems, like, yeah, it can take a long time.
Yeah. Yes. Ahead of it, be proactive, talk to somebody who is educated on whatever topic you want to discuss, right? And your chances of success will, you know, exponentially grow. It's often overlooked, as you started with, right? Why do people overlook this? What can they do to prepare? I mean, the short answer is you got to talk to somebody. It's not taboo. There's people out there, there's networks that you can tap into. There's plenty of people who have sold their companies over the last, decade, right? That I'm sure they're in touch with. Talk to somebody, get some advice.
So, with that being said, and kind of close out our discussion, is there any final thoughts, things that you want to make sure that we touch on? If you're talking to an owner, president, manufacturer, those kind of things, is there anything that you want to just say, this is the key, this is the focus, anything you want to leave them with?
Well, I think you can attest to this, right? I mean, not just talk to somebody, but talk to an industry expert, right? I mean, selling a manufacturing company or preparing a manufacturing company is different than preparing a, gas station or convenience store for sale.
That's why we don't do OBGYN clinics.
Exactly. Exactly. But so, if you're going to talk to somebody, whether it's manufacturing or distribution or e-com, you know, find somebody who is highly educated in that space that really understands, the industry and what the nuances are within that industry that matter and can prepare you to get through those nuances, can prepare you, you know, of what a realistic outcome looks like. I mean, I think the industry expertise can't be underemphasized. Somebody that really understands your space is, a good place to start.
Yeah, it really comes down to at bats, and you think about, one of the things in consulting we talk about, yeah, the reason that we can do it faster is because we've had 100 times the number of at bats and we failed 5 times more than everybody else around us, right? So
Yeah.
the reality is you just seen all the problems and
Yeah.
you know where all the landmines are when you start. So I love that kind of that mindset going
Well,
forward.
yeah, you're spot on. And I'm not comparing myself to a physician, but I mean, if you're going to have brain surgery, you're not going to go to your general physician for him to perform that task. You're not going to go to an optometrist for right. I mean, physicians have very narrow lanes that they stay in because I mean, someone's life is on the line.
Right.
Right now, this isn't that, but in that same idea, yeah, it's the same idea. You want to talk to somebody who knows the space and has been there and done that.
Love that. So with that, I just want to say thank you. This has been great. I already know a couple of clients that will want to send this to right away who are going through this process. So if anybody wants to reach out, they can just connect up with us. There'll be contact information for there. But again, John, thanks for joining us, and it's been great.
Appreciate you having me, Jeff. We'll be in touch. Have a good weekend.
All right, you too.
All right.